Hi, so I'm back and we're talking about sense and sensibility. I was so excited to share with you today this information that I found on the conflict and gender roles in the novel and the way that conflict is dealt with, particularly through dueling, which the mention of dueling in this novel is so subtle that I'm sure I missed it the first two times I read it and only caught it this time just by chance. When I did, I had to go back and research it a little further so that we could really dig in and talk about what's going on here. So, just to begin, my first slide says of deathbeds and beginnings. Jane Austen's first novel begins like many Disney movies with the death of a parent, and so many of those folk tales and fairy tales and coming of age novels, things like Jane Eyre, begin with the death of a parent. Harry Potter does too. And this is a literary tool, really, so that the orphan is thrown into the world on their own and then has a chance to prove himself or herself. In this case, it functions a little bit differently because the mother survives, but in this case, it is the women who are thrust into the world to survive by themselves without the men. And I think that has a very particular effect that Jane Austen explores greatly in this novel. So, really, the absence of a male protector in the Dashwood family is a major factor in creating conflict within the novel. This can be seen through their father's failure to provide any sort of an inheritance or income for the women in the family. It can be seen through their brother's indifference to responsibility. Certainly, John Dashwood could have done better by his sisters, and he just simply, for one reason or another, doesn't. It's also seen by the circumstances which led to their poverty. So, the fact that this old gentleman, as he's referred to in the beginning of the novel, wills Norland Estate to Henry, it's entrusted to John, but he just likes this little itty bitty boy and thinks that the estate should therefore belong to him. And so it's such a whim and so capricious and fickle of him just to say, oh, that little boy, I like him. I think I'll give him all my worldly possessions. And it's this huge estate that then is promised away from the girls. This is likened then to the institutional sexism inherent in male primogeniture, the fact that the setup for inheritance did typically go to the oldest man, but I mean, it really is just like the toss of the dice who gets these things sometimes. And so it does seem capricious and fickle that primogeniture even exists, really. But of course, they had to have some system. So I think Austen is really pointing up the men's lack of responsibility and their failures at the same time. And it's the particular characters, these particular men's lack of responsibility and their failures by the women in the family, together with this institutional sexism that is going on in England at the time, and she's mocking both of them simultaneously. The absence of financial resources is also equally distressing, though, and we've talked a lot in class about the connection between finance and sexism, and the idea that for women, really for anyone, to have true power over your own destiny, you need to have the ability to make, control, and move money. And so a lack of financial resources was really distressing for women in this time. The Dashwood girls really didn't have much to go on financially. And this is a contrast with Fanny, who has some wealth, which she has inherited from her mother. It's a contrast to Miss Grey and Miss Morton, who are the young women who are rivals of the Dashwood girls and seem to be being thrust at these men simply because they come with large dowries, a large sum of money upon their marriage. Um, it's comparable to what Lucy still has, and it's comparable to the younger Eliza Williams, both of whom are also somewhat taken advantage of at different points, although certainly less so with Lucy. So the absence of a strong male figure could actually be a little bit symbolic, we think. One of the articles I read introduced this idea that it parallels the lack of a strong male figure in government at the time the story was written. Basically, Jane Austen was writing during what was known as the Regency era. As you all know, King George III of England was known to have literally suffered from insanity toward the end of his life. And as he was on the decline, he was no longer allowed to rule the country. His son George IV ruled as regent, but that didn't give them this feeling of having like a really strong leader in charge, quite the opposite. So, in many ways, the absence of a strong male figure in the family could parallel the absence of a strong male figure or a strong leader really in government during this time. In terms of plot, this absence also creates a void, then, which is to be filled by the young women's future husbands. So, this is where we get to the question of dueling. It comes down to Mr. Willoughby's decision to take advantage of Marianne, her lack of male protection and supervision, and he flirts with her and he leads her on, and he sort of does some things that could endanger her reputation. Never quite crosses the line, but dances dangerously close to that line of ruining her reputation. And on the other hand, Colonel Brandon does everything in his power to defend Marianne, to help Marianne, and to gain that reputation back. Willoughby is what we would call a stock character. It's a character that we see in many of Austen's novels. If you read Pride and Prejudice, or if you're familiar with Pride and Prejudice, you'll see a Regency rake in that story as well. The rake is a term for a man who is charming, but he's also very discourteous. He just takes advantage of people, and he really just acts entitled. So he's just kind of a rich boy who does what he wants and doesn't worry about other people's feelings. So I'm sure you guys can think of some modern day characters that might parallel that as well. On the other hand, Colonel Brandon is a bit of a stereotype as well. He's a soldier, and as such, he's really bound by this sense of duty and honor. So he's a retired soldier, or he's not he's not actively fighting or anything like that. But he was a colonel in the army, and he just takes that sense of duty and that need to protect others very seriously. So these two opposing forces of the Regency rake and the soldier really do actually represent sense and sensibility as much as the two oldest Dashwood sisters do. We talk about Eleanor as sense and Marianne as sensibility, and certainly that's true. But in many ways, Brandon is sense and Willoughby is sensibility. Willoughby gets carried away with his emotions. He does what he wants. He's very romantic with a capital R, whereas Brandon is quite the opposite. So if you did happen to miss this little exchange, it occurs in chapter 31 when Colonel Brandon is speaking to Eleanor about some of the past events in the novel, and Eleanor says, "Have you ever seen Mr. Willoughby since you left him at Barton?" "Yes," he replies gravely, "once I have. One meeting was unavoidable." Eleanor, startled by his manner, looked at him anxiously, saying, "What? Have you met him too? I could meet him in no other way. Eliza had confessed to me, though most reluctantly, the name of her lover, and when he returned to town, which was within a fortnight after myself, we met by appointment, he to defend, I to punish his conduct. We returned unwounded, and the meeting therefore never got abroad. So nobody ever really found out about it because nobody was wounded. So the fact that they mention that they were unwounded definitely tells us this was actually a duel. Eleanor sighed over the fancied necessity of this, the fancied necessity that he fancied that this was necessary. He thought that it was necessary, not that it was necessary, but the fancied necessity. And to a man and a soldier, she presumed not to censure it. So she might not really approve of this, but she understands why Brandon felt like he needed to do this. And he was defending Eliza at this point, Eliza Williams, but we'll talk more about that in a minute. The purpose of a duel during this time period, also known as trial by combat, really was to let God decide. The idea was that if we put this argument in the hands of God, then we'll just turn it over beyond our own powers and let God decide who lives and who dies. So that really is the idea behind the duel. We know that they probably used pistols because no one was harmed. During this time period, swords or foils were sometimes used for dueling, but that was really starting to fall out of fashion. Pistols really were the more common form by this time period for a duel. They were the more common choice of weapon, I guess. However, pistols were incredibly inaccurate, and death was far from imminent. In addition to this, and as many of you guys know from the Alexander Hamilton-Aaron Burr duel, many times a gentleman would throw his shot away by either shooting at the ground or shooting at the sky, and hope in turn that his partner would do the same. So we're really not sure at this point in time whether the pistols were just really bad and that's why neither one of them was hurt, or if they both intentionally threw away their shots, like Alexander Hamilton, or if one of them did and the other one shot poorly. We just don't know. There was a very real danger involved in dueling, and death was always a possibility. And we actually see, if you backtrack to where the two men left town, both unexpectedly, over the Eliza issue, we see that Eliza was the reason for both of them to leave town unexpectedly earlier in the novel. And that both of them left with a sense of danger, a sense of imminent danger, not being able to vouch for their return. Brandon leaves the party very suddenly. They were getting ready to go for a visit, and you'll remember he gets this letter and he dashes off, and he says, "So uncertain is my return that I dare not engage for it at all." So he can't tell them when he'll return or even if he will return. Willoughby, by the same token, when he leaves the Dashwoods very quickly and unexpectedly, he is also going to deal with the Eliza situation. And he also hints that there is an uncertainty that he will even return at all. He says, "My engagements at present are of such a nature that I dare not flatter myself." And then he breaks off and he becomes very flustered. So both men have reason to believe that they may not make it out alive. It really is a case of the good, the bad, and the ugly. You've got Willoughby, who seems good but turns out to be bad. You've got Colonel Brandon, who maybe seems a bit ugly but turns out to be good. And you've got this whole situation at hand, where these two come to an inevitable, their conflict comes to an inevitable head. So Brandon's sense of duty toward both Elizas is really notable here. Now, the older Eliza, which is Eliza Williams, who is in the current situation, it's her mother, but the older Eliza was raised as his father's ward. So it was sort of like a sister, but she was adopted into the family. She wasn't a true relation. John is Eleanor and Marianne's half-brother. And at the beginning of the novel, John and Fanny make a thing of not doing more for the girls because they're only half blood. Well, you know, here's Brandon, who's not even a blood relation to Eliza, and he goes to great lengths to protect her and to look after her child and to do things for her in a way that John never does for Eleanor and Marianne. Now, the entire situation with Colonel Brandon and the two Elizas really does demonstrate male proprietary instincts. His treatment of women as property to be guarded. He's a gentleman and he's a good guy, and in many ways, and he wants to defend these women and to take care of them. But, you know, make no mistake, he's treating them as property to be guarded and protected. And both men really do act out of self-interest because Brandon not only is trying to protect these women, but he's also trying to defend his pride. Here is Willoughby, who has not only mistreated Eliza, but he's also taken from Colonel Brandon the attentions of Marianne, which Brandon was sort of maybe making a play for before Willoughby came on the scene. So this is probably a contributing factor to their conflict as well. While Colonel Brandon and Willoughby represent the soldier and the rake, Edward Ferrars is outside of these stereotypes. He's an aspiring clergyman, and he operates out of a sense of duty, but it doesn't have that same sense of violence or pride that Brandon's sense of duty has. He honors his vow to Lucy Steele, um, even putting aside his own emotions, which is a trait that Jane Austen paints in a positive light. And Eleanor similarly puts others' needs above her own when she assists Edward in securing a parish. So these two characters really do turn out to be the heroes of the piece in this story. And these two characters are in many ways above stooping to the level of conflict that in which Brandon and Willoughby engage. So my sources for this, of course, Sense and Sensibility, but also these two articles from the Persuasions publication from the Jane Austen Society of North America gave me this information. If you have any questions on the conflicts that I discussed in this PowerPoint or anything related to conflict in Sense and Sensibility, please don't hesitate to send me an email and I'll be happy to respond. I'm going to go ahead and pause here for a little bit and then come back to talk about reviewing for your test in yet another video.